Good afternoon. I'm Dan Longo, First Vice President of Commercial Lending at Liberty Bank. Today's CBIA presentation is about building a mentoring program that works, which is a timely topic as our bank has hired 19 interns for the summer. And actually, I just finished up with the one-on-one with our department's intern. Liberty Bank is a 199-year-old mutual savings bank with over $7 billion in assets. We have 55 branches throughout Connecticut and Western Mass. I'm pleased to say that the CBIA and Liberty Bank have been partners together for many years. We're proud to be the series sponsor today, and I believe you're really going to enjoy our presentation today. So let me introduce Alison Martin, founder and managing partner of Engage Mentoring.
Dan, thank you so much. I am so thrilled to be here, and I'm excited that each of you have chosen to spend your afternoon, or at least part of it, with us today. This is a topic I'm extremely passionate about, so you're going to hear that coming through. And I will tell you that my goal is that each and every one of you are going to walk away with maybe just even thinking a little bit differently about mentoring, and at a minimum, you're going to have some actionable insights that you can take away from this session. My goal also is for this to be interactive, so we're going to have some opportunity for questions and answers and some discussion along the way. And in fact, if you wouldn't mind, I would love for you to utilize the chat feature. And if you could just introduce yourself, I'd love to see who's here today. If you could share your name, your title, your company, and also just the first name of the first person who comes to mind for you when you hear the word mentor. So your name, your title, your company, and the first name of the person that comes to mind for you when you hear the word mentor. Now, I will tell you, my first mentor was a woman by the name of Pat. Pat was somebody that I met when I was just 26 years old. So I was 26 years old and I applied for a position that I was wholly unqualified for. It was a regional vice president of a department I had no experience in. And so for whatever reason, Pat gave me the interview. And although I did not get the position that I applied for, I was offered a lateral move. And later, Pat was responsible. She was my senior vice president when I moved into my first executive role. And so I look back on my time with Pat and I realized that she had so much to do with my early career success. Now, I will say that Pat did not often deliver feedback with a whole lot of finesse. And I'm going to date myself just a little and tell you that when the movie The Devil Wears Prada came out, I was convinced that somebody had made a movie about Pat because she was also very striking in her appearance, just like Meryl Streep. And having said that, I learned so much about executive presence and confidence. And as I said, she wasn't just a mentor for me, she was also a sponsor. So later in the session, we're going to talk about the distinction between those terms. But we know the top of mind concern for every CEO, every manager, and every leader is making sure that your leaders are capable of leading. And so that they have the skills necessary to be successful, which ultimately leads to retaining and attracting talent. And in addition to that, it's worth noting that as it relates to women in executive roles, there continues to be a gap as it relates to representation there. And when asked to describe a talent magnet culture, so if you think about the term talent magnet culture and what that really evokes for you in your mind, respondents use words such as encouraging and ethical and honest. On the other hand, when asked to describe a talent repelling culture, they use words such as undervalued and disengaged and no growth. And in a talent repelling culture, the symptoms on the surface often include low retention and high turnover, but this can be masking low morale, siloed communication, and even lack of trust. And when employees leave, what do they tell you? 9 times out of 10, they say, I got a better offer, I got more money. And that leads us to believe that all we have to do is keep scrambling to pay people more money. But Glassdoor did a study that showed that company culture was 12.4 times more likely than pay to be a predictor of whether someone stays or goes. I'm going to say that again. Company culture is 12.4 times more likely than pay to predict whether someone stays or goes. And while the key drivers for employee engagement have not changed, or for a positive culture haven't changed dramatically, so they include a concern and value for employees, teamwork at all levels, caring and competent senior leaders, effective managers who engage their employees, as well as professional enrichment and professional growth opportunities. And if you've been in the workplace long enough, you remember the Gallup survey that asked the question of, do you have a best friend at work, right? So the idea and the drivers for what make a positive culture have not changed dramatically. And the impact of having what we call a positive culture is really nothing short of profound. So in terms of both job performance, reduction in turnover, as well as a decrease in sick days and in productivity. And while those drivers have not changed, while the key drivers haven't changed over the years, the generational priorities have changed significantly. And if you are right now responsible for talent development, you are feeling this. You are knowing this. Dan talked about their internship program. It's a very different culture in terms of the kids that are coming into the work. I'm sorry, the young adults who are coming into the workplace. And so the key drivers have not changed, but the generational priorities, where historically financial incentives have been the driver for productivity, Gen Z is specifically calling out mentoring. They're specifically calling out mentoring. They want to know that they're going to feel supported, they're going to feel developed, and they're going to see a path. And often, and again, they're a generation that has been connected and they're used to that instant feedback. So we also talk about how they're looking for feedback, not always necessarily constructive feedback, but feedback nonetheless. And we know it really starts with your leaders. So having leaders who are compassionate, empathetic, have demonstrated success, strong communication skills, commitment to the development of others, as well as self-awareness. We should all work for leaders such as these. The good news is these skills can actually be taught. And the even better news is mentoring and having a formalized mentoring program and process is perhaps the best way to teach leaders how to engage, right? It's not just enough to have the skills necessary. It's important that we're teaching them how to engage. And in fact, we often think of mentoring as being a one-way street where the mentee is the eager benefactor who's learning and the mentor is just there to donate their time. But we actually see more leadership capacity development on the mentor side when you really engage your leaders in again, engaging the next generation, and it can impact helping them spot talent and really, again, developing their empathy, developing their self-awareness and their communication skills. And we know mentoring, when done well, works. In fact, it has huge implications on retention and productivity. And also, if you think about this for just a minute, regardless of the size of your organization, going back to what I shared earlier about the generations, what do you think it says to a prospective employee when you're able to say, by coming to work for us, you are going to have access to mentoring relationships? It is part of our formalized process. And so having said all that, I want to talk now about why then most mentoring programs fail. So some of you may have experienced this in the past where you've had some starts and stops with your mentoring program, or maybe you have a mentoring program right now that isn't producing the results that you would hope for. And some of the reasons may surprise you. In fact, the first reason is that typically there's a heavy focus on relationship versus learning. And so in other words, we're helping people in our formalized mentoring programs make friends versus really taking into account what the developmental opportunities are of the mentee. So if you think about that for a second, what happens often is we look through the lens of whether we think these two people are going to get along versus what the learning outcomes really need to be for the mentee who's working with the mentor, or because you can't track outcomes on a relationship. And so if I kind of going with me on that example, if you match two people and they get along, they're going to say things like, oh, it was great. I really loved working with my mentor. It was fantastic. We learned about each other's dogs and kids and talked about a whole host of things. And so you'll hear that, but it's really impossible to measure outcomes of a relationship in that fashion. And the opposite is also true. So if the relationship doesn't take hold, then both parties don't feel like they benefited from it. And if you're in the unfortunate role of having to reassign people and mitigate hurt feelings, that doesn't feel very fun either. And so that is actually the number one reason most mentoring programs fail, is because our matching is based more on relationship, and we're over relying on the relationship to take hold. The second reason is not being scalable. So again, we have different sizes of companies represented here today. And so the perception is that all we need is an Excel document. We're just going to match people. And if you do that, even on a small scale, we've talked to people who it's practically someone's full-time job to run a 20-person mentoring program. And obviously, as the company grows, you can't accommodate that. Or if that person goes away, there goes the mentoring program. So not being scalable. The third is relying on traditional hierarchies. So the way this shows up in most organizations is they will arbitrarily say, okay, you're a director and above, you're going to be a mentor. Everyone else is going to be a mentee. And if you do that, it fails. First of all, most companies have more or fewer directors and above in their organizational structure than they do people below that. And so what happens is already you have more eager mentees than you have available mentors. But it also fails to account for the peer mentorship that can occur, or even the holy grail, which is the reverse mentorship. So having leaders who are vulnerable enough to be able to connect to the next generation in a mentoring fashion. And so relying on traditional hierarchies will eventually cause the program to fall flat for those reasons. The fourth is mediocre training or no training at all. At Engage Mentoring, we believe very, very strongly in training and making sure that everyone has context in terms of how they're approaching the mentoring relationship. We're going to talk a little bit more why later. But one thing we often have is the perception that people are either good mentors or they're not good mentors. We believe that everyone can be taught. And when you teach people how to mentor, really amazing things can happen in terms of developing leadership capacity. And then also lack of measurement. Not knowing how to measure, not knowing what to measure, going back to number one, not having anything to measure or a mechanism for doing so. And lastly, bad matching. So bad matching, again, ties back to one, in that often we match people based on whether we think they're going to get along, rather than taking into account the true developmental needs of the mentee. Or someone else is doing those matches on behalf of someone else with kind of looking through that lens. So I would love to hear from you. If you could utilize the chat feature. I'm guessing you're here for a reason. So you're either starting a mentoring program or you've been a part of a mentoring program. I'm just curious what challenges you may have experienced in the past with some of the formal mentoring programs that you've been a part of, either currently or in the past. Not enough leaders. Thank you so much. That leadership buy-in is so critical. The identification and training of good mentors, effective matching. Thank you so much, Becky. Too many leaders. Interesting. Ashley, tell me more. Any other thoughts? Thank you, Ashley. So differing opinions. Actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, Ashley. When I was part of a formal program, this would have been years ago, more years than I care to admit. I was part of an organization that actually rolled out a formalized mentoring program at the time. And so I got selected to be a mentor, and they brought us into a conference room and they gave us all free backpacks, which was great. And our training was basically, here's what you can talk about, here's what you can't talk about, here's what you need to report to HR. So you can share your perspective, but you can't overstep the manager. And by the way, if they're telling you that they're harming themselves or the company, you need to report that to HR. So I remember leaving that training and having no idea what I was supposed to do. And what you just said is yeah, leaders can have different opinions. And so it really is up to the mentee to really discern from that and be able to take and also, again, that was the piece about the deferring to the manager. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Ashley. Thank you. Leaders that say they're too busy to be mentors, so not committing the time. Great. I mean, not great, but thank you for sharing that. Another is not everyone we want to be a mentor wants to be one. They want to know what's in it for them. They don't want to give up their time. And And then the last is most crew level employees desire an incentive to train or mentor. So creating a sustainable incentive. I'm glad you all brought that up because that is also, it probably needs to go onto the list. Because often there's this perception that as a mentor, I'm donating my time. And that's something that we really stress is this is actually leadership capacity development. We believe that everyone, regardless of their level, can benefit from the perspective of others, as well as benefit from growing as a leader by learning how to pour into others. And so that sort of incentive, and also really combating that perception, right, of that I'm being asked to mentor, so therefore I'm donating my time in favor of other things that I could be doing, but really helping them recognize that this is really part and partial to how they grow as a leader. And in the process, they're going to spot talent, they're going to meet new people, and they're going to develop some incredible relationships along the way, even as a mentor. So helping to make sure that marketing, it's funny because there's so many nuanced things, isn't there? It's not just the matching, it's not just the training, and it's not just the context, but it's a combination of those things. But it also starts with the marketing. So how do we recruit people to be part of this, be transparent about the time commitment, but also hold them accountable and have them be engaged, right? So it really is important to address all of those things. Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. And so for mentoring to work as a formal process, the measurement needs to be addressed. Also outcomes. So starting with outcomes in mind, not every company has the same outcomes. So for some, it's more about learning, others it's more about retention, promotability, employee engagement scores. So there are a lot of different ways to measure the impact of having a program. Also the administration addressing that. And so once again, just making sure that there's an effective plan in place to help ensure that all of the things that we're talking about today are being addressed, and that we're starting with the end in mind, really thinking about what it is we want to accomplish together. And finally, the training. We've been talking about training, but I'm going to say it as many times as I have to. Having context for being effective on both sides is really important. And so at Engage Mentoring, we define mentoring as knowledge transfer. So I want to make sure we talk through that because I'm going to expand on that a little bit because mentoring is knowledge transfer ideally based on successful experience. So in other words, the mentor has been there, done that successfully, ideally, they're self-aware and they're sharing their perspective on their own learnings along the way. I will tell you, it is actually a powerfully effective shortcut for learning for your employees that's often overlooked because if you think about what we've learned along the way by working with other people, that is how we learn. And so it's often overlooked because it doesn't appear to be efficient, but is actually a powerfully efficient way for people to learn is through connecting them with mentors on topics where they need to learn more about. And then it's tied back to an individual development plan. I know, easier said than done, but mentoring is knowledge transfer based on successful experience. Now, mentoring and coaching are two terms that are often used interchangeably. And the way that we talk about mentoring, so we've already established mentoring is knowledge transfer. Coaching is typically moving someone from point A to point B. And effective coaching doesn't usually rely on the coach's experience in doing so. It's more about asking good questions, accountability, and so it may be that you bring in a coach to shore up a particular skill set, or you're coaching your employee to make sure that they're getting the outcomes that they need. And so while mentoring can sometimes bleed into coaching, mentoring is heavily reliant on experience. Coaching is really about asking good questions and holding people accountable. And so a coach does not have to have experience in the area that the person they're coaching in has. So you could bring in a coach from the outside who doesn't necessarily have industry experience because they're skilled at outcomes. And so the best analogy for that is a coach of a basketball team doesn't have to be a world-class athlete themselves in order to be successful. And the last term is sponsorship, or being a sponsor. And so a sponsor, the way we define sponsor, is an advocate. So going back to the earlier scenario that I shared about Pat, as Pat and I grew together, she absolutely was a mentor for me early on, but she started advocating for me. So she was responsible for much of my early career success, because I had a series of promotions as a result of her telling others that she felt like I was ready. And so that is what a sponsor is. And we've seen organizations that kind of developed a sponsorship program where arbitrarily someone was assigned to sponsor someone else. And we we believe that in order to authentically sponsor someone, it really does start with mentoring. So hopefully that clarity helps. We believe that all of us at any given time should potentially have all three. But mentorship truly is about that knowledge transfer. And usually when mentors understand that, it feels like the pressure's off. Right? They're there to share their perspective and their knowledge based on their own unique set of experiences. And the mentee sort of is able to do with it what they will. And when we look at the litany of things that mentoring can really help people develop by serving as a mentor, it really is amazing. And again, it goes back to the marketing of how do you make sure that your leaders are willing to commit the time, which in our programs, it's 1 to 2 hours per month, to pour into others and really the outcomes that you might expect in everything related to culture, and having leaders who don't just have the knowledge, but are actually transferring that knowledge and doing so with intentionality. And so that brings me to some training. And you've heard me say it multiple times now that mentoring training is really important. At a minimum, both mentor and mentee really needs to have a framework for how they're going to approach the mentoring discussion. And so mentors should think ahead of time of what their expectations are, how they like to work with people, and how they might also be able to help their mentee the most. So thinking ahead of time is really beneficial. But then also, what are they hoping to gain from this partnership? I will say the most successful mentors that we have do a lot of listening, right? So mentors are not just there to drone on about their entire life experience, but to really get to know their mentee and help diagnose how they would best be able to help them. But having this framework ahead of time is usually very helpful. Now, earlier when I shared my example of the mentoring training that I had, the mentee, by the way, was assigned to me. And that mentee had zero training. And so if any of you, I didn't see this in the why most mentoring programs fail when you were talking about the experiences that you've had. But in my experience in that scenario, it ended up being almost like a professional venting session versus what I now know to be true mentoring. And so I share that because it's perhaps even more important for the mentee to really be prepared for the discussion and to help them put their best foot forward. So helping them to understand and think ahead of time of what they expect from their mentor, what their goals are. It's so important that the mentee really comes and has done their homework on the person that they're working with and is prepared to ask really good questions and has in mind what they're hoping to learn from the mentor going into the relationship in order to track those outcomes. And also even thinking through what they can do to potentially help the mentor and what they're hoping to gain from this partnership. So those are the things that from a very basic framework level, it's important that both parties really come to the relationship with that same set of goals and expectation and preparedness. And so matching participants is critical. And so matching, as I've said earlier, really should be based on learning outcomes and developmental opportunities for the mentee versus just purely relationship. And so, again, often we fail to measure the mentoring program effectiveness because we didn't put those protocols in place to the beginning, or again, a lot of times we're just matching people and kind of hoping for the best and relying on their feedback. But there are a lot of different ways that you can actually measure impact, and that includes the program feedback as well as the hours of sessions that have taken place, the topics that are selected, measuring skill development and learning outcomes for the mentee. You can also benchmark against employee engagement scores. Again, some of those things are often more the larger companies, but you can do that as well as retention and promotability studies. But at a very basic level, all of the first four can absolutely be measured in order to really determine impact and if it makes sense to continue to make this investment of time and resources. And so I'm curious, again, this is another discussion question. What are you currently doing to ensure your leaders have the necessary skills to be successful? I would love for your feedback on this. How do you ensure that your leaders are engaging? How do you ensure that your leaders are have the skills that are necessary to continue to attract and engage the talent that we all strive to have? So I'd love for you to use the chat feature and share any thoughts. And I think we could all benefit from seeing what others are doing. Great. Oh, this might be related to the mentoring program, a kickoff training session with both mentors and mentees before they're expected to schedule their sessions. That's great that you're doing that. Thank you. .360 surveys. Great. More frequent reviews, less formal than annual performance. We use developmental records with different levels of skill sets depending on desired positions. Daily huddles, weekly touch points, external leadership programs. Thanks for saying that, Ashley. These are all great examples, by the way. And I will tell you that the investment you make, particularly in your leaders, in your leadership structure, it's not just about having leaders who have the skills. It's important to have leaders who are engaging, who are visible, who really know how to pour into others. And that's the intangible that organizations who have made this investment in a structured program will see is they talk about culture. They talk about people knowing how to pour into others and others knowing how to cultivate relationships with others and to get the answers that they need and the learning outcomes that they deserve. And so those are the things that are sort of harder to measure, but culturally you see a huge shift, and we call it what we call a mentoring culture, where again leaders really know how to engage and others know how to access the perspective that's needed for them to be successful. So our why and why I get up every day and do the work that I do is that we believe every employee deserves the opportunity to reach their greatest potential. So what we do is we come alongside with companies and help engage, inspire, and develop their people through meaningful feedback, which is tied to learning opportunities with measurable outcomes. Based on our name and our discussion today, you might note that we specialize in mentoring. We absolutely do, but we believe an effective program really starts with meaningful feedback that's tied to learning opportunities with mentors and producing measurable outcomes. And the last thing it's worth noting is two things. One is we do work with companies of all sizes. So our largest client has our product deployed in 30 countries, and we work with smaller companies as well who are scaling and growing. We have a unique way for employees also to potentially access mentors both inside and outside of the company for those companies who are scaling and growing. But in any scenario, we are a full service partner that has a tech-enabled program, and we serve as an extension of your team. We're not a tech company, so we don't just hand over a technology and say, hey, send it out to your people, hope for the best. For all the reasons that we talked about today, technology is a small part, a small but essential, but a small part of that overall equation. And all of the nuances of what we talked about today really need to be addressed. And so this is what makes us unique. So the first thing, and I mentioned this earlier, is we provide peer exchange opportunities. So we have scenarios where your employees have access to mentors both inside and outside of the organization, as well as other group learning opportunities in addition to the one-on-one. The other thing that I also mentioned is that we incorporate individual development plans. So we believe in not just giving employees feedback, but giving them feedback that's meaningful and also tied to tactics, right? So if I said to any one of you, hey, you need to work on your communication skills, you could walk away from that interaction and say, okay, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to take a class? Do you want me to go sign up for Toastmasters? What does that mean? And so all of our participants and all of our programs have the opportunity to get their manager to share feedback on the topics that they choose. And then they choose the topic, they choose mentors to work with them, and we're able to track those learning outcomes. And then we handle all the details so you don't have to. So our programs at present, when we work with an organization, include a women's program because there are statistically fewer women who occupy leadership roles. We actually even have programs in that space for individual executive women as well. And that particular program called the Executive Club is actually being launched in Hartford. And then in addition to that, we have our Engaged Leaders program, which in all cases, we typically start small, not big, but we work towards having a program that's open to all employees in an organization. So I am going to open it up to questions, but before I do, I would love for you to grab the QR code. And I would love for you to share your thoughts, share your feedback on our session today. Mentoring is not the most exciting topic in the world, but I'm so glad that you are all here and you stayed with me. And hopefully you're coming away with having some actionable insights as a result. Natasha is also going to share in the chat the actual direct link to the survey as well, if you don't have your phone available because you're so present in our time today. So Natasha, if you wouldn't mind sharing that link, that would be great, or you can grab the QR code from the screen. So while you're doing that, again, please, I would love 100% of you to just share your feedback, because I was sharing with Natasha, this is my, I think, 4th time during this session. So I would love any constructive feedback or if this was helpful to you. But I'd love to open up to questions and discussion as well. What if you have more mentees than available mentors? Michelle, thank you so much for that question. So there's a variety of things that you can do in that scenario. So one of the things that we encourage is that, again, in a topic-based mentoring structure, the way that we do, we like to see people that are both willing to share their perspective with others and also have the ability to connect with others, recognizing that regardless of where you are in the organizational chart, we can all benefit from learning and sharing with others. And so we don't like to make that hierarchical distinction. We actually like to allow people to make those connections on the basis of topics that they want to learn more about. So that's one way to combat that. The other way is through an external mentoring program where you have the ability for your mentees to connect externally as well. The second is, what are the tips for effective matching of a mentor-mentee? Becky, great question. So our matching is actually based on competency or topic. So the mentor takes an assessment and identifies the topics that they would be willing to mentor on. And then the mentee goes in and selects a topic and selects a mentor to work with them on that topic. And by doing that, what it does is it creates an inherent boundary around the relationship. So I probably need to add this to the list too. Part of the challenge with mentoring programs is that we match people and the mentor feels pressure to have the answer, to every topic, right? And so, and if they lack self-awareness, or they feel like they're there to be this person's mentor, so therefore they have to give their opinion. Giving an opinion not based on successful experience or competency is just that. It's an opinion. It's not true mentoring. And so effective matching really should center around learning outcomes for that reason. And then Michelle said, our group sessions good. Group sessions are fantastic, and it's a form of learning for sure. It certainly doesn't kind of give the opportunity for people to let their hair down and really get to know one another and allow the mentee to really reflect on their own developmental needs. But supplementally as learning, in fact, I'll just share this analogy as well. Often when I ask people to reflect on who comes to mind for them when they hear the word mentor, sometimes, or inevitably, at least a percentage of people don't have anyone because they can't think of anyone in their life that they would call a mentor. And I often challenge them and say, we're all inspired by others, even if we don't have direct access to them. So in those group sessions, that certainly can apply, and that it's learning. And so that's a great option for sure. I believe group sessions should supplement the one-on-one learning opportunities if possible, and that's why all of our programs include that. Tools to get conversation starters: reading a business article together, watching a TED Talk, or just start very basic and tell me about you. So providing that framework and making sure that, again, if you're introducing a process, that there are prescribed agendas in place is super helpful. And then also recommended articles and resources that can supplement the learning. So I'm back to, there is no one perfect mentor on all topics. And so if your goal is learning opportunities, it's important to supplement that, or even have the mentor. Often they're not asserting that they're an expert on the topic. They're sharing resources and articles and books and things that really help them grow that competency as well. If you have mentors volunteering as you're developing your program, how do you recommend identifying the ones that will be effective and require minimal training versus the ones that may not be good fits? We believe that training is required regardless. And I think, well, first of all, it starts with asserting their commitment, right? So if you have participants who are volunteering to mentor, making sure that you're validating that they're willing to commit the time and that you're really clear about what that time commitment is. But we believe everyone should go through the same set of training because 100% of us, even today on this call, might have different ideas of what mentoring is. And so just having a consistent way for people to be trained would be recommended regardless of, again, some people are going to be naturally better than others, but we believe everyone can be trained. Thank you for that question, Becky. Other questions? Do you usually have a set time frame for mentor programs? Yes, Becky, that's also a great question because a lot of times, especially for the companies that end up investing in technology, they have this fantasy that they're just going to invest in technology and then people are going to sign up and then boom, they have a mentoring program and people are just going to naturally turn to that resource when they're stuck. And we believe in having a defined time for the start and stop, and that we validate the commitment of people at least on an annual basis. And that what you're saying also, Becky, is true, that that we're transparent about the number of hours that we expect, the amount of months and that sort of thing as well. And then any other local groups to Hartford other than for executives, not that we're a part of, but our Mentoring Women's Network Executive Club is specifically for executive women. And it is, so it's a national program. So participants have access to executive mentoring across the country. But the goal is to have local opportunities for connectivity in the top 50 markets by the end of 2025. So we've had some early interest in the Hartford market. And so if you have an interest in that program, I would encourage you to indicate that when you fill out the survey as well. Any other questions? Well, let me just reiterate, I am so grateful for each of you for being here and just how interactive and thoughtful you've been. I was sharing with Natasha, I love it when people can come on and actually talk and I can see you on camera, but I'm hopeful that that you found this time beneficial, and regardless of the size of your mentoring program, that you have some actionable insights to take. As I said earlier, this is what we live and breathe every day. And so if you're looking for a resource to help support, again, regardless of the size of the company, that's what we really pride ourselves on. We believe every workplace should have a structure for this, that this is not a nice to have, but a need to have. And access to relationships needs to be part of every organization's talent strategy. So, and if you're small, it even begs the question of who's mentoring your leaders. And so having access to external programs can be hugely beneficial as you're growing as well. So again, feel free to reach out. I'm on LinkedIn as well. I'd be happy to connect. But again, I'm just so appreciative of the opportunity and that you each chose to spend part of your afternoon with me today. And when we were talking earlier that, depending on how long the Q&A goes, I don't know that anybody will object to having a little bit of time back this afternoon. But again, I'm appreciative, would look forward to connecting with you further if you have any questions or are looking for some additional resources. Thanks so much. Thanks, Dan, and thank you, Natasha, as well.